Section 3 of History of Rome and the Popes in the Middle Ages, Volume 1, by Hartmann Grissar. Chapter 1, Last Revival of Paganism in Rome, Part 2. The Fate of the Roman Temples. The fate of the heathen temples and statues in Rome at the time of this epoch-making revolution has often been quite wrongly represented. It is decidedly untrue that the temples were then either destroyed or else at once handed over to Christian worship. Neither were the statues of the various gods overthrown. Anyone demanding destruction of the temples in those days would simply have wished to turn the city itself into a vast pile of ruins. They were so numerous and vast, both in extent and proportions. Had they been even offered to the Christians, the latter would have been much embarrassed by such gifts. Christians were already well provided with basilicas, which met the requirements of their new service much better than the elaborate temples in Greek or Latin style, with their small shrine for the idol and their extensive porticos. Above all, who could accept the enormous expense of maintaining such magnificent structures? Throughout all the years preceding 526, actually no statement exists relative to any temple in Rome being turned into a Christian church, still less of any violent injury to their contents. When, during that year, the Templum Sacrae Urbis, with Romulus's rotunda on the Roman Forum, were turned into the church of Saints Cosmas and Damian, that could scarcely be called putting a heathen temple to Christian use, for both buildings were public rather than religious edifices, and not exactly temples. In the East, they certainly went much more quickly to work with changing pagan temples into churches. Violent destruction of heathen places of worship frequently occurred there through the overzeal of Christians, and especially of the monks. In those countries, the Christian emperor's decrees against paganism were much more severe, particularly with regard to temples in the open country and private buildings for pagan cult. Laws were also often enforced with Oriental excitement. As we stated, however, it is a mistake to imagine a similar state of affairs in Rome. Such acts are only described in the forged inscriptions of Pyrrhus Ligurius, and these texts have now been proved quite apocryphal. On the other hand, historical documents and archaeological searches are yielding a mass of reliable testimony to the real fate of these temples and statues in Rome, and all proved unanimously that they were spared and protected. This testimony agrees, too, with contemporary imperial enactments when properly interpreted. Such tolerance had its roots in the classical education and culture, which were still dominant, even among Christians, in the Rome of that day. Both subjects and rulers considered these temples simply as monuments. It seemed an understood thing to them that the capital of the Roman world should not be deprived of such glorious works of art, of such stirring memorials of their nation's doughty deeds. Once freed from superstitious ceremonies and cleansed from unhallowed rites, res in licite, as the law termed the details of idol worship, the temples could remain to the glory of the world's metropolis. They were closed, but they enjoyed the protection of the public authorities, watching over them as state property. All the same, ancient temples must be divided into two classes. The first, indeed the greater number, had been directly dedicated to the gods. The other had had a predominant municipal or public destination, and served various useful civic purposes. During the 5th and 6th centuries, the first category were absolutely deserted. Christians avoided and dreaded such desecrated spots, and spiders spun in peace upon the altars, to which formerly all sorts and conditions of men had flocked for help. They awaited the medieval destruction of antique Rome to enhance the ruin of the metropolis by their downfall, or else to renew their youth at some future time in the form of Christian churches. The second order of temples, thanks to their more practical destination, were more readily adapted to useful government or municipal purposes. They were utilized, with the revenues belonging to them, as monuments to great citizens, as halls for public receptions or meetings, as buildings for the safe custody of important public documents or archives, and so forth. They were thenceforward cared for by the Christian rulers of the state. This was the fate of the famous temple to Saturn below the Capitol, of which the 8 majestic granite pillars upon the lofty substructure still form the grandest monument on the Roman Forum. This Aedes Saturni had served less as the dwelling place of the god or the site of his worship than for the protection of the state treasury. There were special quaestors and special praefectae aerae, who had the Aerarium Saturni under their care. Under the Christian emperors, the building lost its pagan title and its idolatrous service, but the treasury continued to be kept there. For this reason, as early as the 4th century, about the time of Gratian, this Aedes had the privilege of being restored, or rather, one might say, rebuilt. The grand ruins now existing belong to this new edifice, but the work shows traces of the decadence and superficiality of architecture towards the close of the empire. The bases of the columns are of unequal size, and in 3 pillars, the blocks forming the shafts are inaccurately placed. This period already took great liberties where art and taste were concerned. One must also place the previously mentioned temple of the Holy City of Rome, now Saints Cosmas and Damian, among the second class of temples. The well-preserved rectangular buildings and hall had been utilized as a registry for the care of survey and assessment rolls. For this reason, the temple bore an immense plan of the city carved on marble upon the wall facing the Forum of Peace. Since 526, the circular temple of Romulus, son of Maxentius, which also stood upon the Roman Forum, formed the vestibule to the church of Saints Cosmas and Damian. It had been erected by Constantine the Great to the honor of his house, just as other temples had been built by this emperor to the glory of the gens Flavia. These were simple monuments devoid of all religious character. The temple of Romulus, as well as Templum Sacrae Urbis, could therefore both be converted into the church of Saints Cosmas and Damian without any transformation of an actually pagan shrine. One could also reckon among these secular edifices certain temples which had almost become museums from the numerous and valuable works therein accumulated. In time, these readily lost all the religious character they had ever possessed, but continued to exist as public monuments. We further meet with various edicts promulgated by the Christian emperors, which expressly command the preservation of heathen temples, especially in the city of Rome. Under this head, the brief order given by the Emperor Honorius shortly after the death of Theodosius is particularly noteworthy. It runs, "As strongly as we forbid idol worship, so strongly we desire to preserve public monuments as ornaments to the city." At Rome, in the year 408, Honorius repeated the edict that, "In towns and their suburbs, temples are to be treated as state property, but their altars must everywhere be overthrown." In the country, temples were in no way equally protected. Nevertheless, lest destruction should overtake the magnificent temples of the Campania, the Emperor Constans had taken special measures for their security. The reason given is important, being an entirely new plea for respecting these ancient structures. "Many of these shrines," he says, "have been the origin of public sports, circensia or agonalia. Nor is it seemly that aught should be destroyed from which the time-honored pleasures of the Roman people have been derived." Early Christian Rome clung with tenacious enthusiasm to these old established games. This is a characteristic feature in the history of the city's transformation and gives us a clue by which many historical problems may be solved. Here, as elsewhere, one must differentiate between actual pagan and purely civic customs. The civic and historical side of earlier commemorations, and not their pagan sense, was what all wanted to preserve. It was hopeless to uproot these festivals from popular and municipal life, but it was the work of church authority to guard against heathen religious elements again obtaining any footing. It must be confessed that this task was often a very difficult one. Constantine the Great had permitted directors of the sports attached to temples erected in his honor to be called sacerdotes, that is, leaders, in the secular sense of the term, and many similar words were retained in official use. This is evidenced by such public calendars as we still possess, for instance, by the Philocalian in the middle of the 4th century and that of Polemius Silvius in the middle of the 5th century. We cannot, therefore, be surprised that late in the 5th century the Ludi Castrorum were celebrated by the Romans at Ostia under the auspices of the Christian city prefect himself. No one dreamt any more of worshipping Castor and Pollux, but all objected to give up the lively public sports bearing their name and held upon the sacred Tiber Island. What we have just stated should dispose of many accusations nowadays circulated with reference to the attitude of Christianity, and such details at the same time give useful hints for judging this whole transitional period in Rome. The importance of this subject justifies us in digressing to investigate the fate of a much venerated pagan sanctuary outside Rome, which might even be ranked with the abode of Vesta. We allude to the famous Arval shrine in the fields bordering the Via Campana. These buildings, which are still in partial preservation, might be called a vast monument to the downfall of paganism. The sacred shrine of the Arval Brethren, Fratris Arvalis, was situated beside the 5th milestone on the Via Campana, which branched off from the Via Portuensis. All along this ancient road, across the undulating country bordering the Tiber, stood the monuments of the worship of the Dea Dia, traditionally believed to have been founded by no less a personage than Romulus himself. During the balmy days of the temple, the flower of the nobility, even scions of the imperial house, belonged to its college of priests, the so-called Arval Brotherhood. Beside the shrine of the Dea Dia, another temple, called the Caesareum, stood amidst the verdant plains. Here, close to this sanctuary of the rural goddess, the deified emperors were worshipped by the Arvals. Games had been instituted and were held in an adjoining circus, a sacred grove surrounding the whole seat of the Arval worship. When Gratian's law, confiscating temple property, was promulgated, this grove was expropriated, but no one touched the temple. Excavations seem to prove that the grove came at once into the hands of the Church, for Pope Damasus, in the 4th century, built a Christian oratory near the outside boundary of its precincts. During recent local searches, remains of a dedicatory inscription were unearthed addressed to Saint Beatrix, or Beatrice, and her brothers, who all suffered martyrdom for their faith and were buried during the Diocletian persecution in the Christian cemetery already established near the grove, and called the Quaemetrium Generosae. Evidently, therefore, under Diocletian, there were Christian catacombs hard by the site of pagan ceremonies, a fact which seems to signify that, even in the time of that emperor, heathen functions at this spot had lost much of their importance. The Arval temples continue to exist in all safety under the protection of the imperial legislation. Though Christians had secured a footing all round them, they were never attacked. The exceptionally rich store of ancient inscriptions with which one of the temples was covered has thus been preserved to our day. For value and importance, no collection of epigraphs can be compared to these Arval inscriptions. They not only record the observance of the annual May festivals, but also the sacrifices offered in honor of the birthdays of the emperors and their relatives, as well as for each important event during their reign, including the admission of fresh priests, all with precise dates and names belonging to the highest rank, thus furnishing a rich fund of invaluable historical data. In the grove, too, inscriptions had been put up in several places. These were unfortunately scattered, just because the grove was not considered inalienable public property. From time to time, fragments of them were found in and about Rome. This makes the undisturbed temple inscriptions all the more fascinating, forming as they do a sort of gallery of epigraphic specimens. In the medieval period, when as yet intact, they must have dropped or been detached from the walls originally supporting them, for the whole collection has recently been discovered in the immediate vicinity of the walls, and future excavations will probably allow of more being brought to light. In spite of most careful examination, the neighboring catacomb of Generosa did not yield a single one of these stelae, though the marble of which they consist would have seemed specially appropriate there. The only explanation seems to be that the Roman Christians of the 4th and 5th centuries evidently and intentionally spared the Arval temple. Thus this remarkable spot, where the new religion came in such close touch with the old, once more strikingly proves the self-restraint practiced by the Church when dealing with monuments of paganism. Moreover, during the lifetime of Pope Damasus, who died in 384, the general Christian toleration towards buildings for heathen worship received brilliant public confirmation. Symmachus the Rhetor, the champion of paganism, was accused of having unjustly punished Christians when city prefect for the pretended crime of injuring the monuments of pagan cult. Pope Damasus, on this occasion, gave evidence in favor of the accused prefect. He testified in court that no Christian had suffered any unfair treatment from Symmachus. The prefect on his side was able to confirm that, as a fact, no Christian had ever even faced such an accusation before his tribunal. The historian Zosimus, a bitter heathen, cannot bring forward any instance of a temple in or near Rome having been destroyed under Theodosius. He contents himself with lamenting that Theodosius, after the overthrow of Eugenius, had excited all minds against the holy rites, turning both priests and priestesses out of the temples and leaving the altar devoid of sacrifice, dishonored and neglected. Zosimus certainly mentions in his history that Serena, as previously related, took off the gold ornaments from the goddess Rhea, and subsequently adds, with ill-concealed disgust, that during the siege of Rome under Alaric, jewelry adorning the sacred images was melted down, but he thereby only proves that, both inside and outside the temples, their former divine inmates had, till then, been left in undisturbed possession of their gorgeous ornaments. The Christians were therefore still less likely to have spoiled the temples themselves. It is also evident that in Rome, which alone concerns us at present, nothing occurred analogous to the violent destruction of temples reported from the East. Still, in the old city of the Tiber, it is always possible that individual cases of violence, sacrilege, robbery, or injury may have occurred, especially after the last brief revival of paganism. As an extremely rare commemoration of such an incident, we find in an underground Christian burying vault on the Via Salaria Vetus a feeble and badly drawn representation of the overthrow of a heathen idol. One may also accept that at Rome, paganism took up a less aggressive attitude than in the East. There, risings among the Christians, or outbursts of fury among the monks, were often due to scandalous action on the part of heathen priests and their adherents. The magnificent Serapeum at Alexandria was sacrificed in 391 during such an outbreak under the fanatical patriarch Theophilus, but its fate was mainly due to previous heathen riots. Theodosius's edict ordering the destruction of the Serapeum and other so-called holy places, both in Egypt and the East, almost all devoted to equally immoral rites, declares expressly that acts of fierce hostility on the pagan side had called forth these severe measures. Yet certain passages in the Church Fathers seem to stand in flagrant contradiction to the above statements respecting the heathen temples in Rome. As a fact, such expressions simply prove the intense satisfaction experienced by the best men in the Christian Church at the complete collapse of paganism. They are enthusiastic flowers of rhetoric, but not sober historical facts. When preaching to his own congregation, St. Augustine exclaims, "All the idols in Rome have been overthrown." St. Jerome, in his usual lively strain, even amplifies the picture. "The temple of Jupiter is overthrown, and all heathen rites are at an end. The golden Capitol lies neglected in the dust. People hasten past the tottering shrines to the martyrs' tombs. All who are not converted to Christianity by common sense and reason must be brought to it by shame." One need only place such tirades beside the celebrated passage of the poet Claudian, himself halted between Christianity and paganism, in the same year, 403, that Jerome gave vent to his excited fancy, Claudian describes quite contrary facts with equal, if not greater, poetic fervor. He points to the still towering pagan temples in Rome. He enumerates the whole magnificent series of religious edifices in the Roman Forum, and the superb collection of bronze statues representing both gods and heroes. Of course, in such passages, the Fathers are not actually dwelling in the material wreck of the temples, but on the spiritual downfall of paganism. When they come to positive details, even St. Jerome, with all his historical learning, cannot name any instance of temple destruction in Rome, except the high-handed clearance in 377 of the great Mithraeum in the 7th city district, undertaken by the city prefect Gracchus. We have already described this, but we may add, in connection with the whole proceeding, that Gracchus's action was justified by the strict letter of imperial law. It was in no sense arbitrary, but till then, the law involved had never been put in practice in Rome.